Okay, so let's go ahead and get started finishing up Unit 1, Lesson 1 for dual credit government through the We the People textbook. So the slide we left off on was, what did the founders learn about government? The founders really looked at two different important principles from all of their studies that we talked about so far. The first was that government should be the servant of the people, meaning that the government shouldn't be the one that's all powerful and dictating rules to the people. If the government makes rules, it should be representing what the people want, not that the government has the power just to do it arbitrarily. And the government is the servant of the people, not the master of the people. The second principle is that a fundamental higher law or a constitution should limit the government. Just like in Article 1, Section 8 of our Constitution, where we have enumerated powers that say what the government is and is not allowed to do. And I have a little graphic up here about limited government as well, saying that absolute power corrupts absolutely. I want you to think about what that means for a second, that absolute power corrupts absolutely. You could have a very sincere, warm-hearted individual take a total leadership role, and usually that ends up not working out the best for the citizens or the members of that organization or group or whatever it may be. Nobody really likes to live in an organization where one person has total or complete control over their lifestyle. So in our government, each aspect of government controls your life as one less aspect you control of your own life. So, the fact that the government can control your education, that's one less thing you can control. The fact that the government controls your water supply, that's one less thing that you have control over. And we talked about on the first day how many things the government is involved in. So keep that in mind when I say each aspect of the government that controls a part of your life, that's one less thing that you have power over yourself. So that idea of a limited government may be fading a little bit here in the United States. Next, what forms of government could the founders choose from? So this is part of your homework assignment for Unit 1, Lesson 1. But we're going to talk about it here also. And we're going to go all the way back to Aristotle. And he's really one of the first philosophers that digs into this concept of political philosophy and classical republicanism and things like that. So Aristotle distinguishes between a few different types of government here. And he talks about correct forms of government and deviant forms of government, essentially meaning the right way to run a government and the wrong way to run a government. So he says if there's one ruler, a correct way is a kingship. Now, we might not necessarily think of that today, but once you go back to 300 BCE, that might be much more of a realistic approach to how to run a kingdom as a kingship. Now, if that king was to become destructive, if that king was to pass laws arbitrarily to limit the individuals, it would have been called tyranny or a tyrannical leader, okay? So we can look at history and see a lot of different examples of tyranny once somebody takes total and complete control. So we can look at Hitler as probably a great example. Stalin is another example of a tyrannical one ruler. If you have a few rulers, you might want to call that an aristocracy, kind of like a nobility that they had during medieval times, the Dark Ages, where you had aristocracy running things. The deviant form then would be called an oligarchy, okay? This would be a rule by a wealthy few. So not as much of a change in power between multiple groups. We're just talking about the rich people essentially having rights, is what Aristotle meant. And then the correct form with many rulers is a polity, and the incorrect or deviant form is democracy. Now that is something I think is very interesting, that he calls democracy a deviant form of government when we put so much emphasis on democracy here today. But in actuality, in America, do we even really have a democracy? No, we don't even really have a democracy. We have a republic. We have the ability to vote for representatives that would then be our rulers. Okay, mixed constitution. This is like what Great Britain has. with a weak monarch and aristocracy in one branch, which would be the House of Lords, and then a democratic branch of people in the House of Commons. In today's world, the House of Commons has a lot more power to pass legislation, and the House of Lords isn't even necessarily aristocracy or nobility anymore. It's a lot more of the wealthy lawyers, very respected people of society that get put in there and don't really have a whole lot of legislating power. It much more derives its power from the House of Commons or the people. So going back to the idea that the government gains its power from the people. Also, representative governments, known as republics, that originated in Rome. Almost every group in society was able to elect representatives, and that's how we had it in the colonies as well. So, going back to some of these major, political ideologies, we can also look at with the representative governments, we can look at the writings of Plato and Cicero, and also Aristotle, and talk about the influences they had on the three functions of government, and how a representative government should work. And, some of these old writings talk about deliberation, execution, and judging. Well, then I want you to think about our three branches of government. Deliberation, that's our legislative branch, deliberating laws and passing laws. Then we also have the execution of the laws, which is the president's job, to ensure that laws are followed by citizens, and then judging the laws, our judicial branch, interpreting the words in the Constitution. All right, so what is a Constitution? Constitution is a plan that sets forth the structure and powers of a government. So we have a Constitution here in the United States that we're very proud of. We talk about it all the time. That's what this class is essentially based off of, is the writings of the Constitution. So I have a copy of what the original Constitution looks like over there on the right, and then that's supposed to be what it looked like deliberating at the Philadelphia Convention with George Washington standing up on the podium there as the president of the convention and try to fit as many delegates in there as possible, although most historians agree that this is definitely not what it looked like because there were so many set structured rules. Anyways, back on topic. Constitutions must be able to make, enforce, and interpret the laws. Going all the way back to what those early philosophers said was the point of a government. The Constitution, or any constitution, is made to make sure that people follow those laws. So then you have a few different types of constitutions. Okay, you have a written constitution and you have an unwritten constitution. A written constitution is exactly that. It's a constitution that's written. It defines what the powers are. Now, the one thing that's difficult with a written constitution, especially with the United States written constitution, is that it's very difficult to change it. And some people argued at the Philadelphia Convention that the Constitution should never be changed. This should be a permanent document. But they ultimately came to the conclusion of a very difficult process to amend the Constitution, which we've only done 27 times in our history, the last time being all the way back in 1991. So this isn't something that happens regularly. This isn't something that happens to change the Constitution. We don't take that lightly. That's a very serious thing. So, a written Constitution, some problems with it is that you're bound to leave some rights off of a written Constitution, which is why the Anti-Federalists demanded a Bill of Rights after the Philadelphia Convention and when ratifying conventions were meeting in the different states. So they demanded a Bill of Rights essentially because they said the Constitution doesn't include freedom of religion. It doesn't include the right to bear arms. It doesn't include the right to keep soldiers from quartering in your home. So they needed to include those things. So they argued a written Constitution was naturally going to have the flaw of leaving some rights off. Same thing with, similar with an unwritten Constitution, I should say. Not in a single written document, but this continuing set of laws. And we've talked about this a little bit with Great Britain and their unwritten constitution system and establishing common law from ruling to ruling with different judges. So it's a very foreign concept. The British Constitution is, thousands of pages long. It's, probably millions of rulings by this point, setting precedents that they need to follow. So it's much more complicated to interpret what their unwritten constitution is opposed to a written constitution. Going back to limited government again, why have a constitution? Constitutions, even though they may leave some rights off, even though they may, if they're unwritten, leave thousands of pages of documents to browse through to figure out what the decision should be, constitutions limit government's power by providing enumerated powers like we have in our Constitution in Article 1, Section 8. It tells them what they're allowed to do. But then it also says in Article 1, Section 10, the denied powers, the things that the Constitution limits our government from doing, which is equally as important as giving the government certain powers, is limiting their power, making sure they don't overstep some of their boundaries. All right, what kinds of government may be constitutional governments? Any type of government could technically be constitutional. I mean, we can look at Iraq right now with ISIS storming through the countryside, killing women and children, horrible atrocities going on in Iraq right now and parts of Syria, but they still technically are ruled under a constitutional government. You can look at all these different countries around the world that may have corrupt governments or governments that are about to fall apart, but they still have a constitution. So what are the keys to having a successful constitution? The keys to the government respects the limits set forth in the Constitution. So the problem you see in a lot of these countries where the democracy, the representative government is falling apart, is when you see the dictator, the leader, the tyrannical leader disregard the rights that are outlined in that Constitution. If they disregard those rights and they declare themselves the dictator after being elected, the people don't really have power over the government. So that goes along with the second thing. Many times single rulers expand their power by ignoring the Constitution. So I have two images up here. On the bottom left you have Thomas Jefferson stating, "The greatest danger to American freedom is a government that ignores the Constitution." And Thomas Jefferson has all sorts of famous quotes about the power of the government getting too big. He was extraordinarily fearful that leaders would ignore the Constitution or that the central government would take too much power from the states. He was very, very much a person that wanted a limited government. That is until he became president and he expanded the size of the entire country by twice its normal size. So, it's easy to say that people ignoring the Constitution is the greatest danger, but Thomas Jefferson did it himself as well. But you can definitely argue that, declaring martial law, ignoring the right of habeas corpus, a lot of the things that are already outlined in the Constitution, if you ignore those rights, that could be disastrous for our current state. The other one is an image where it's supposed to be President Obama, and it just says, "Limited government, you bunch of extremists," and he's talking to the Founding Fathers. So obviously, President Obama has expanded the power of the president exponentially from what the Founding Fathers originally intended. And we can really go all the way back to President Lincoln and start looking at the expansion of presidential power, or even all the way back to President Jackson and look at the expansion of presidential power. But I mean, we can look and see that President Eisenhower overstepped his boundaries. We can look and say President Johnson, President Nixon, President Reagan, both Bushes, Clinton, they all expand the presidential power by doing different things, ignoring certain parts of the Constitution. And America has kind of allowed them to do this. The judicial branch hasn't taken an active role in stopping the executive branch, and the legislative branch really hasn't done much to try and limit the presidential power. Some political scientists would argue that they do this just so they can continue to bash on the president and tell everybody how poor of a job the president is doing without having to risk their neck, saying what they actually think. All right, that is it for the PowerPoint. Hopefully you can watch this and catch up on the lesson.